So good morning everybody and welcome to this session in the main arena studio here at London Valves, and welcome not only to the audience that we have here in the studio but also to our virtual community joining us online. I'm Prendergast and I'm very grateful to Medtronic for supporting the programme this morning, which takes us outside the programme so far, which has focused on technique, new devices, innovations, guidelines. And this morning we're going to turn our attention more to the pathways that support our patients as they go through a TAVI procedure, the referral networks that surround us, the ways in which we can refine our pathways and make them more efficient, and importantly, as we emerge from COVID, how we take some of the lessons of the last 2 years and the transformation of our practice to the advantage of our patients for the years and decades to come. To do so, I'm joined by an excellent faculty, Dan Blackman from Leeds, UK, Hein Danenberg from Jerusalem, Israel, and Stefan Toggweiler from Lucerne, Switzerland. And to support me in the programme, I have Darren here as the moderator. And Darren, we're going to be looking forward to interaction with the chat as well.
Absolutely. So whether you're here with us in London in the studio audience, or whether you're at home or in the office, we would encourage you to interact with us, to use the app if you're in the studio audience, or of course the chat function if you're online. We're very lucky to have Professor Thomas Pilgrim online as our chat master, and we're eagerly awaiting your questions and very happy to get those questions to our distinguished panel this morning. So please send those questions in to us.
So we'll move on. We have a short session this morning, and our first speaker is Hein, as I have already introduced. And Hein is going to tell us how we use new tools in a digital age to collaborate across our referring networks. Hein.
Thanks, Bernard. So I'll discuss in short how to collaborate with our referring physicians in this digital age and in COVID times, trying to make the procedure smoother, the referral much faster and more efficient for the patient. Okay, so here are my conflicts. And this is how surgical aortic valve replacement looked like in the early 50s, back in the previous millennium. It was a maximalist procedure, and you can see here dozens of, more than dozens in the room. While today, TAVI is a minimalist procedure, same-day admission, 4 people actually in the room, and quite an efficient procedure. And we're trying to see whether we can minimalize the whole process, what we define as the patient journey to the procedure. So this is actually the journey of the aortic stenosis patient. Diagnosis, referral, initial decision on therapeutic options, a workup, the final decision on the therapy, procedure, and back to the referring physician. So there are numerous new digital health technologies, wearable devices, the mobile health apps, and the others. We're using very few of these, mainly the telemedicine, to make the whole procedure a much smoother and faster one. So diagnosis in most cases is an ambulatory by the GP, general physician, which needs to refer the patient to one of the following: cardiac surgeon, interventional cardiologist, a clinical cardiologist, or in most cases now to the valve clinic, a multidisciplinary one, where the initial decision on the therapeutic option is done, TAVI, surgical aortic valve replacement, in some cases just balloon valvotomy, or conservative therapy. And you could see that the number of TAVI is quite increasing. And actually, the referral and the initial decision can be done by telemedicine. There is no need actually to see to bring the patient to make an appointment at the hospital. There are some challenges like reimbursement, liability, some technical issues of how to transfer the data, and of course the informed consent, and actually setting up the expectations with the patient and the family. The data can be transmitted quite nicely, the echo, high resolution echo images, and of course the the multi-slice CT scan, which is actually the basis for the right decision. Where are we going to? And we can have the whole data with our hands. And this is actually the basis for the workup, the sizing, vascular access consideration, and all the rest here. And again, going back to the CT scan with meticulous preparation without actually seeing the patient and a decent hard-in discussion, the whole procedure can be done without repeated admissions. There is always the question, should we bring the patient for an appointment for coronary angiography? And I think that Aled Shefo taught us quite nicely, and there are several other studies showing us that in like 75% of the cases there is no need for coronary angio. And actually, Bernard, you taught us quite nicely that even if you do an angio, in many cases we can skip PCI. There is no need for PCI. So just by analyzing the CT scan, most cases can be moved quite nicely without bringing the patient to the hospital. And just decent connection with the referring physician can bring our patient to the procedure. The workup of conduction defects, also ECG, procedural details, and the CT scan, there is no need for an actual checkup. And therefore, I would like actually to offer two new models for this journey of the aortic stenosis patient. The first one, the COVID one may say, diagnosis is done by the referring physician, physical exam, it's all ambulatory by the referring physician. Referral is online. The initial decision on therapeutic option is an ambulatory. We need an office or a Zoom just to discuss options and risk-benefit with the patient and family, and this can be done online in many cases right now. The workup is all an ambulatory one. We're basing, as I mentioned, on the CT scan. The decision on therapy and plan by the heart team, again, ambulatory, and then the procedure is admitted on the day of procedure to the hospital. Of course, there are some exceptional cases in which we need to admit before, and there is another model, which is the accelerated one. Diagnosis is ambulatory, but the patient is immediately referred or is referred to the hospital, and on the same day of referral, initial decision on therapeutic option is done. In some cases, we do it even before. The workup, including CT scan, starting on day one, with the meticulous analysis decision on day 1 or 2, and third day from admission, the patient undergoes the procedure. And this actually calls, when you go through a minimalist procedure, calls for a minimalist approach and early discharge as well. And actually, and this is a personal experience, we can move forward. In some cases in which we used to go to proctor out of the, in other hospitals, we can do this in these digital and COVID days online as well. This is a picture from a case done in Mumbai with proctoring of AI, complex AI case from my office in Israel. We're moving ahead. Things are definitely not the way they used to be. So, in conclusion, the COVID pandemic introduced new challenges, among others, of course, to structural heart patients and physicians. The digital revolution offers novel solution to data transfer, and with pre-procedural evaluation that can be shorter and smoother with astute decision-making and judicious planning, we can go without impeding any of the procedural safety or efficacy issues. Thanks.
So, Aim, thank you so very much, and perfectly on time, which is wonderful. It really sets the tone for this brisk session. So, you told us that communication with patients using digital media is important. You've told us that exchange of medical information and data is important. And you've also shown that exchange of medical education and proctoring using digital technology is the way of the future. Dan, I have a question relating to the patients, because of course younger patients are very ready for digital technology and interacting with primary care, with Zoom or with text or with email. But what about the older community who still represent the majority of patients with aortic stenosis? Are they ready for Zoom consultations and coming in on the morning of the procedure, having never met the patient, the doctor before? Does that work for them, do you think?
Good question, Bernard. I think probably the answer is that it's about bringing in the family, and that's obviously a key part anyway in any patient we treat with TAVI these days, that you need the family to be part of the journey, especially with the older patients, and then the family will help with that digital process and guide the patient through that. And our experience, probably more limited than Heim's in this, but our experience is that actually that works pretty well and that the patients do come on board. There's another question I'd like to ask Chaim, actually, Bernard, if you don't mind, which is, we've done a similar thing, particularly with inpatients, is moving to remote assessments, and that's really helped, and it's something we'll carry on. But one thing that can be difficult to assess remotely is frailty and functional capacity of the patient. So do you feel that you can do that remotely? I mean, when I see a patient in the outpatient clinic, the key part of the examination is watching the patient get up out of their chair and come into the room, or how they get from out of their chair into the room. But that is an important part of the assessment. So how do you manage that remotely?
I think this is indeed one of the major issues regarding this online referral, and we need to rely on the referring physicians as well, and we need to know them. We need to have a constant connection with our referring physicians, and they should rely on us, and we should rely on the referring physicians. And once we speak the same language, what is frailty, how do we rely on different tests, you know that you can come up with this as well. Of course, there are those borderline cases that need to be admitted, that we need to see in the office, but it's not all patients, but rather a small sum of them.
I'm interested in the model, Dan, where you've got patients in another hospital, perhaps with destabilized valve disease, and you have a referral and you don't really know how well or unwell the patient is. Can they go home and then come to you in a few weeks' time, or do they need an inter-hospital transfer? I think using digital technology would be a fantastic way forward there. Stefan, is there much experience with this sort of network approach and using digital technology in Switzerland?
Yeah, I think we're getting there. Also because of COVID-19, we established some outpatient clinics now completely digital. But I agree that in these older patients, more frail patients, it actually helps you to assess the patient when you see the patient, how he walks, how he talks.
For sure. But perversely for them, sometimes the trip to the hospital is the most difficult because of their frailty and their immobility. So I think we need to embrace the new tools that we have available. Darren, I think there's some questions have come through already.
Many of us thought that we had an early morning, but Isra is joining us from Canada, so Isra must be up very early this morning. Our good friend and colleague Holger Egebrecht is wondering if anyone is using the Silo app for communication between physicians. Sometimes you have an echocardiogram or a CT scan that you wanted to share with some colleagues to get some advice. Has anyone any experience with that app?
With that one, but we're using different apps, including Twitter now and including WhatsApp, just to transmit, images, pictures, even still in scenes and short runs to discuss the case, and these are very valuable now in current practice.
I think Silo is I suppose a particular one that is GDPR compliant and is I suppose a particular grade of GDPR compliance that is reasonable for medical physicians. Maybe just to share with you some of our experience living in a geographically dispersed or remote area in the west of Ireland. We're largely able to conduct most of our patient assessments and indeed decisions towards TAVI remotely, in that we'll have patients who come into a remote hospital. They'll have their ECG, their echocardiogram and their CT scan all done in remote hospital. That will all be beamed to us, and we can do the CT analysis remotely, and then have a heart team discussion on our Zoom calls every Friday morning and decide which direction the majority of those patients should go to. Of course, some of them are inpatients, some of them you need to assess in a clinic, but more than 75% of patients, we know where the 85-year-old is going to go, TAVI rather than surgery, so it can be done remotely.
I think you raise a very important point, Darren. I mean, we're all very keen to embrace the new technologies, but the GDPR, or the patient confidentiality aspect of this, is important. As colleagues, we're often exchanging images, ECGs, echo loops informally, but it will only require one medico-legal case where something has been transgressed, and a prominent cardiologist or surgeon is up in the courts because of inappropriate sharing of information. It's a difficult area that we're moving into together, so we need to have our eyes wide open. So we'll maintain the momentum. There's no more questions from the chat, Darren, for us at the moment. Okay, so let's move on now to Dan Blackman. The concept of the TAVI nurse is not a new one. It's been with us since the advent of TAVI 15 years ago. But what we do recognize now is the huge volume of patients that we're processing at any one time. Certainly in my institution, we often have more than 100 patients going through the program at any one stage on waiting lists with different levels of priority, decompensating and ending up in hospital. So there's a constant reshuffling of the pack and a huge amount of work involved. And Dan is going to outline how this has been developed to a very high level in Leeds, UK. Dan.
Bernard, thanks. So I've got my slides up. Yeah, so the TAVI nurse specialist, which I think, certainly in our experience is the key to the whole team and is the core of the team. And I'll hopefully explain to you over the next 7 minutes or so why. These are my potential conflicts. So I thought let's look first at what the interventionist needs to do in the TAVI team, the people who are sitting around the table in this session today. What's our skill set? Procedural skills, obviously, we need to be able to deliver the TAVI procedure safely and effectively, and clinical assessment of patients, which we discussed with Haim there. And this means that we need to be there for the clinical assessment of patients prior to the procedure, involved in the heart team discussion, and performing the TAVI procedure. But what about the nurse specialist? What kind of skill set can they bring? And I think one of the things that's key about the nurse specialist is it is a different type of skill set and maybe a longer list. So they have huge strengths in communication, organisation, shuffling that pack that Bernard referred to. They have a totally patient-centred approach, which I think we all endeavour for, but recognise often that nurse specialists are better than this than doctors are. They provide that key continuity of care that we might struggle to do. And they're excellent at education and information for patients and their families. And also, I think, working across teams, particularly joining surgeons and interventionists, imagers, the whole TAVI team. And that means more or less that they can do everything in the pathway, except perhaps the procedure itself. So we go through the pathway and how we work things in our centre in Leeds, where we're blessed with a fantastic nurse specialist team. First thing that happens is the referral comes in and we triage the referrals, and the nurse specialists, using guidelines and their clinical judgment, will allocate those patients to a TAVI pathway, a SAVA pathway, or to a joint clinic where they'll see both. They'll coordinate investigations, make sure everything that we need is in place before we see that patient, and they'll start the ball rolling with patient contact and patient information. A welcome letter will go out explaining the process and the journey, our information booklet, an information video that we've produced in Leeds, and then links to other resources and websites such as the Valve for Life website. And then I think I've put in bold because it's so important, they'll provide contact details. And the patient will know from there on in through their whole pathway and after the procedure that there's someone there, a friendly voice that they can contact at any time. So what about before the procedure? Well, we, as I've said, will see the patients in the clinic, still mainly in our practice face-to-face, sometimes remotely. But the nurses will see every patient as well, and they'll focus on frailty assessment, cognitive assessment where needed, and again providing information, the things I've already mentioned, but also contacts for past patients. So we have a pool of patients in Leeds who've agreed to be contactable by prospective TAVI patients, and they will talk to them on the telephone. They will go around to their houses and talk them through the experience, and that's hugely reassuring for patients facing what's often a daunting procedure for them. Then the nurses will coordinate the MDT, they'll execute the MDT, and they'll provide during the pre-procedural phase, as I've said, that continuously available contact, particularly important in the event of clinical deterioration, but also if there are any concerns, just someone to talk to. Before the procedure, they'll do a pre-assessment clinic a week or two before, clinical preparation, blood, sorting out the medication, but again, educating the patient and family and managing expectations, planning discharge. And these are key in shortening the hospital procedure. This pre-assessment means the patients can come in on the day of the procedure and they will be discharged earlier with a plan in place. When we get to the procedure, then the nurse specialist can take on the job of conscious sedation or local anaesthesia, depending on the skill set. Of our 3 nurse specialists, we have 2 who are equipped to do this. And I don't want to upset any anaesthetists, and we have fantastic anaesthetists, but in my opinion, the nurses do this job better than the anaesthetists. And that's just because what they do is they give fewer drugs and they talk to the patient more. And that gives the patient a better experience and a faster recovery. After the procedure, while we're still getting on with the rest of the list, they'll already be aiming to get the patient mobilised early. Then they'll take on the job of daily clinical assessment until discharge, bring us in if there are any issues, plan discharge, organise rehabilitation. For same-day discharges, which are still rare but occasional, they'll organise blood tests in primary care, and they'll organise the follow-up. So follow-up will be an early telephone contact for the same day or day 1 discharges, or if there are any concerns, and then a remote follow-up, currently universally remote follow-up unless the few cases with major issues to assess symptoms and quality of life. We usually aim for the pre-discharge echocardiogram so that the early follow-up can be remote, and then they'll plan long-term follow-up either in our centre or in the referring hospital. Broader role outside the pathway, communication. Communication with referrers, so our nurses send out regular newsletters to update our referrers on our programme, which patients they should be referring, whether there have been any changes in the pathway. We're currently undertaking regular visits to the referring hospitals, where our nurse specialists, accompanied by one of our clinical medical team, are spending half a day in the referring hospital, so they're kind of available for a walk-in. The clinicians from the local hospital can come in and talk at any time that suits them. And from time to time, every few years, we'll organise a regional conference for referrers. Communication with patients. We have an annual patient meeting. That's vital for us to get feedback about what we can do better. It enables us to bring patients in to helping to improve our pathway and to develop our patient contact group. Communication with cardiac surgeons. That can sometimes be challenging, but our nurse specialists are great. And I think, I'd encourage anyone who's considering this to ideally, as we do, have nurses who come from, at least one, from a cardiac surgical background, and that helps to build that link. And finally, communication with the research team. Many of us work in research active programs, and the nurse specialists on the clinical side work closely with the research nurse team around consent and recruitment. So the question that I was asked to answer was, how does the TAVI nurse specialist add volume? Hopefully some of the things I've shown clearly emphasise that. You streamline the pathway. This means patients get through quicker to treatment, and that means you can treat more patients. We can do more TAVIs in a day through streamlining the procedure, early mobilisation, very light touch, local anaesthetic and minimal sedation. Streamline the admission is a key one. So on our standard 4 TAVI day, 1 of the patients will come in the night before, 3 will come in on the day of the procedure. And then the discharge planning means they get home earlier. That creates greater bed capacity. We do TAVIs Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and we need those Tuesday, Wednesday patients to be moving through to create the beds for the next list. And all of these things they do, of course, free us up to do the things that we need to do, seeing patients, doing more procedures. And as I've said, through their communication and their outreach work, they're attracting more referrals. What does the TAVI nurse specialist team also add apart from quantity? It really is quality, especially quality for the patient and their experience of the TAVI pathway. And I'd like to take this opportunity to pay tribute to our 3 fantastic nurse specialists in Leeds, Abby, Pete, and Kerry. You can see straight away just by looking at them that they look a lot more approachable and better at communication than I do. So thanks for your attention.
So thanks, Dan. That's incredibly impressive. It strikes me that you should teach them to do the transfemoral procedure, and then they could just run the whole programme.
Well, we did have a nurse who we trained to be the second operator, but they got poached by industry, so that's the one thing that you've got to watch out for. So.
But I'm sure there are several specialist nurses here in the audience, here in the studio, and joining us online. And on behalf of the medical TAVI community, I think we owe you a huge vote of thanks for enabling the progress of TAVI over the last decade, in particular, with the growth of volume that Dan has described so nicely. So, Stefan, do you have similar models in Switzerland, and do they run at this level of sophistication?
Yeah, we do, but I would like to ask a question. Since we're talking about the digitalization, and I like that the nurse is doing a lot of these processes, like the screening process, the in-hospital process, the discharge process. Isn't that something that maybe in the future can be automatized?
Yeah, no, I'm sure it can. And we have started moving that direction with COVID. So, as I said, the follow-up is now remote. So, because we know if we've got a good post-procedural echo, and sometimes it's even the on-table post-procedural echo, then there's no real need for the patient to come back. So that's gone remote. And at the moment, we still see most patients face-to-face for the initial assessment, and I guess that's mainly about communication and frailty assessment, but I agree, that's definitely something we can move.
I think I fully agree. I mean, the communication is great, the approachability that you can call a number, someone is there, it's a friendly person. But I think, for example, what we have in our software, the clinical information system, we automatically, for example, schedule the pre-discharge transthoracic echo and the ECG and the lab. That's automatically done as soon as you press the button that you have done TAVI. And I think that's a little bit where we're probably going to. Also, we have a tool now programmed where we can monitor the patients on their journey, the screening, the procedure, the date of admission, the date of discharge, and so on.
What we've done with follow-up in London, Stefan, not least because the distances are frequently quite long for patients, all of the post-procedural follow-up is done by telephone by the nurses, as Dan has outlined. But we have a weekly drop-in clinic that has empty slots, and if they need a patient to come because there are some unexpected post-procedural problems, they can just drop patients into those clinics and we just see them ad hoc on an as-required basis. And that has, again, proven to be a very efficient and effective model, particularly in COVID. Darren, how are we doing on the chat? Or any questions from yourself?
Yeah, so one of each. Lauren is with us here on site, and a question for you, Dan. She's talking about there's no real job description currently for the TAVI specialist nurse, and how do we move forward as a group and try and formalize those job descriptions so that each centre isn't trying to reinvent the wheel, so to speak, when they try and develop this type of position?
It's a good question. I think one of the advantages, but difficulties in defining it tightly, is that the nurse specialists take on different roles depending on their pre-existing skill set. So, and I think that's the advantage of having a number of nurse specialists. I think we have 3 nurse specialists for a program between 350, 400, and I think that's what you're looking at, one for every 100 to 150 procedures. I think getting TAVI nurse specialists together. So in the UK, there is now a real network of the TAVI nurse specialists, and I think we owe a debt of gratitude to industry because they've helped support that process. And that they're leading that process of defining what nurse specialists can do and educating centres who don't have nurse specialists as to how they can look at building a nurse specialist program and what different roles those nurse specialists can take on. So I think we're seeing that kind of network building. And it's bringing nurse specialists into the mainstream. When meetings like this, when we have a TAVI team of surgeons, interventionists, and imagers, we need to add nurse specialists to that list.
That was my follow-on question for Bernard. So in Euro, of course, we have an active program for allied healthcare professionals. Any thoughts in terms of developing that type of program for London Valve for the TAVI nurse specialist community?
You're quite right, and in the past we have had specific sessions dedicated to the nurses and the allied health professionals who support our TAVI programs and make them work. Let's be honest about it. Clearly with COVID, it's not been quite so straightforward in the new digital format, but you are very much an included community, and we will be working on that in the years to come, without question. So we're now going to turn towards our final speaker, Stefan Toggweiler. And Stefan, we want you to talk about 2 difficult subjects, money and managers.
Absolutely.
And the topic is how you get the resources and the support you need to grow your TAVI program in often very difficult times. So over to you.
Yes, thank you, Bernhard, for this very nice introduction. So I would like to share with you a bit the story how we moved from a standard minimalistic TAVI program to a lean TAVI program and share with you a little bit the challenges we experienced during this process. So I think it's fair to say that hospitals are very complex organizations because they're highly specialized units working together under the same roof. They share some of the resources, but of course some they don't. There are very strong historical barriers. So you often hear, we have always done it like that, it works well like that, why should we change? And the stakeholder engagement is very complex. So in Lucerne in October 2019, and that was before the COVID-19 pandemic, we were facing some challenges. We had a reduction in ICU capacity. We actually were not able to perform elective procedures anymore. And then shortly thereafter, we also had a shortage in anesthesia care. And then, of course, there was COVID-19. So we had to come up with a solution how to continue the program. And the idea was to perform TAVI without an anesthetist in the room, without intensive or intermediate care unit. We actually now perform TAVI with no sedation, and surprisingly, the patient is actually more still during the procedure than with conscious sedation. Also, we do same-day admission in the morning, fasting. We encourage, of course, early discharge. We minimize the transport route and the risk for nosocomial infections. Of course, we do need anesthesia and ICU available as a backup in case we have complications. And so therefore, if you establish such a program, it's important to include all the stakeholders in this patient pathway. And of course, patient safety remains the single most important aspect. Now, this is visualization of patient transport routes. In red, you can see the standard minimalistic TAVI pathway we had in Lucerne before. And now we do this lean TAVI pathway, and you can see the patient is admitted directly to the cath lab in the morning. And then we consent the patient, we do the TAVI, and we monitor the patient just outside the cath lab for a few hours, and then the patient is transferred to the ward, and usually after 2 nights is discharged. This is a picture taken immediately after we treated the first lean TAVI patient a bit more than 2 years ago. And the staff you see here is really the whole staff that's gonna do the admission, do the procedure, and do the monitoring. And I think compared to a standard program, this is really not a lot of people. This is how we monitor the patient outside. We still have an arterial line for the first few hours, just in case the patient has a vagal reaction or some bleeding we don't recognize. Now, this was not the primary intention, but of course, if you minimize the make such a lean program, you also affect the costs, and overall costs were reduced by 18%. And at first sight, this doesn't look much, but of course, the costs for materials stayed the same. So the internal costs were reduced by 60%. And you can see the components here. Of course, there was most marked reduction in ICU and anesthesia care, but also physician fees, nursing, lab testing, and so on and so forth. So this looks quite nice, but I can tell you it was actually not so easy. Although we had a strong clinical need, it was not easy to establish this program. And I think one of the problems is in medicine, we learn a lot about safety and efficacy, but not about efficiency. And management is really all about efficiency. So we have to enter the world of management a little bit. And this is, I don't know if it's called the Bermuda trial in healthcare, but it is believed that you cannot have a healthcare system that has an excellent quality, that is accessible to all patients, and that has low costs. It's probably not possible. But as physicians, again, we look on quality, but we have to start looking at costs, resource utilization, accessibility, and time capacities. How not to get support. I was asking, actually, as preparation for this talk, I was asking some people from the administration, and they told me how not to get support, what they don't like to hear. And honestly, most of us have done it. I've also done it. If I don't get this or that, I cannot guarantee the safety of my patients. And they have heard it so many times, I think.
Threatening words.
Yes, it's threatening. Yeah, it's not the way you should do it. So much better if you offer a solution for a problem and even an alternative. And I think here it's important to be honest, show the pros and cons. and managers are used to choose between different options. So this is my last slide. If you want to change a patient pathway, you should involve all the stakeholders. You have to be perseverant, and it doesn't hurt to have friends. Thank you very much.
So fantastic, Stefan, and a little bit light-hearted and tongue-in-cheek, which is great for this time in the morning, and we're perfectly on time, so we are doing extremely well. Haim, it seems to me that you've also broken down a few barriers in your hospital with the way you've changed the pathway during COVID and so on. Have you any other pearls of wisdom that you can share about how you do that in partnership with the hospital administration?
I think that's what Stefan mentioned, showing the different options and letting the different stakeholders reach a decision. It's not one-man decision here, but many stakeholders are involved. And I think that connecting to what Dan was saying, the nurse specialist is a coordinator. We need a coordinator to coordinate, show the data, come up with the data and show that we're saving on money, we're increasing efficacy, and we're efficient. And once you show this to your, it's not superiors, but rather to the management, you can get more resources with actually their hope that you'll end up saving resources at the end. And I think that we've seen this during the COVID. At first, it took us a little bit more, setting up digital solutions, being more available at first during different times of the day to our patients, to our referring physicians, without seeing them, but then you come up saving on resources and being more efficient.
Thanks, Haim. We've touched on the whole sort of COVID transformation during this session. And of course, another major advantage of transcatheter techniques in the middle of COVID was the ability to treat patients quickly, effectively, without needing an intensive care unit, without needing 1, 2, 3, 4 days in hospital. And, you know, in our program, it was the surgeons who came to us in the first wave of COVID and said, help, what are we going to do with our waiting list? And of course, the answer was TAVI. And, you know, we treated several hundred patients in the middle of the pandemic and, you know, fantastic outcomes. And let's be blunt about it, those patients would have died during the 2 years of the pandemic without treatment for their aortic stenosis.
There is a question now, Bernard. These are surgical candidates. Is there a way back now? Would you send these patients now to surgery, or probably younger patients?
Yeah, so I think it's important that what none of us do is go back to the way we began. We need to take everything that we've learned during the period of COVID, the way that we've refined our pathways, the way that we've adjusted the indications for the procedure. And okay, there's a little bit of a reset required because, you know, we are emerging and now healthcare is sort of getting back to normal. But we need to accommodate and adapt to all the lessons we've learned over the last 2 years, without question.
Yeah, I think in many countries, COVID is not only affecting cardiovascular surgery, it's also affecting interventional cardiology and TAVI.
Yeah. Dan, something that always puzzles me is this whole cost-effectiveness discussion. We saw some very nice numbers there from Stefan, the way in which a lean TAVI program can be much cheaper for an individual patient. And obviously translating that into the hospital budget is a very complex entity. But it strikes me that we never win the cost-effectiveness and argument. And, you know, you and I work in the UK where cost-effectiveness is a big topic. Why have we not been able to demonstrate that in scientific terms to convince people that TAVI is more cost-effective than surgery?
Oh, that's a tough question, Bernard. I mean, I think we have. I mean, there are many countries have now published cost-effectiveness analyses of low and intermediate risk TAVI with nation-specific data, or, you know, combined with trial data. And we've now, I think, France have published data showing that TAVI is dominant in low and intermediate risk in the French healthcare system. We've seen in the US that from Partner 3, in particular, and Evolut low risk, that TAVI is dominant in low risk populations. So we are starting to see those data. I mean, healthcare systems vary between countries dramatically, and the most depressing conversation is if you talk to the management and say, well, we can get the patients out more quickly, and they say, well, all the beds are always full all the time. So, you know, if your patient's not there, it'll just be someone else's. We won't save any money. So it can be difficult to win that argument. But I think we have got compelling evidence and things we can do, as we've seen in this session, that are compelling and hard to argue with, like having a nurse specialist or anaesthetic practitioner managing the patient during the procedure. We swapped an anaesthetist and an operating department assistant, as we call them, an anaesthetic assistant, for one nurse, and that is about a third the cost.
Exactly.
We have patients, they don't go to level 2 beds, as we, the coronary care unit, let alone ICU. They go straight back to kind of the Monday to Saturday or day ward. We know those beds are cheaper. So there are so many things that we're doing now that are cheaper, and I think management do see that, and they do recognise that, and they're keen for us to expand our TAVI programs. And I think the other point I'd make, we're talking about COVID, but certainly in NHS, COVID recovery is going to be a few more years, and during that whole phase, TAVI is going to be a favoured option, I think, including amongst hospital management, not just amongst interventional cardiologists.
And Dan, you've spoken very eloquently as well about the need to maintain the momentum and the rolling programme. On a weekly basis, you need those patients turning over, creating space for each other as they domino through the system and get discharged quickly.
If I can add, I think if we reduce our resource utilization, we also free capacities for others. So the benefit actually goes beyond the immediate reduction in cost of the program.
No, Stefan, you got it wrong. You create capacity for more TAVI patients.
Or even more TAVI patients, exactly. Whoever can use it. We're a team.
I'm joking.
But it is maybe important for the physicians and the nurse practitioners out there to remember that moving from doing a TAVI with a whole anesthesia team with you to doing a TAVI without the anesthesia team with you, there's a little step there. And there's a little bit of education that you have to learn. It is less comfortable. You are less supported at that moment. And I think that it does take a little bit of time to get used to that, Stefan. I don't know what your experience was from moving to having the anesthesia support in the room to having it if you really need it. How was that transition for you and your team?
No, absolutely. Very good point. And in retrospect, because everything went well, it's always easy to say it's no problem, but of course it's empowerment. So the nurses, they do things they haven't done before, and we initially did. So there was a meeting with anesthetists, and we talked about potential complications like AV block or sudden drop in blood pressure and so on and so forth, how to react. So there's certainly a very important point. You have to prepare the journey.
Yeah. And even in terms of education of the staff, Dan, all of our nurses now who do procedural sedation in the cath lab, many of them would not have been trained in procedural sedation until they found themselves on a TAVI list and realized that this was something that they needed to become au fait with. And as you said, it's certainly empowered those staff. A question from Dinaldo, Dan, for you. In terms of the TAVI nurse program, any ideas how we would develop that in a developing nation or in a situation where cost is at a premium?
I think probably the key is to demonstrate how the nurse specialist is going to save you money, because they are doing a lot of the job. When we started our TAVI program, we were doing all of these things, trying to coordinate the list, seeing all the patients in the clinic, filling our outpatient slots with post-TAVI follow-ups that now can be used for seeing new patients or doing other things, replacing, as I said, the anaesthetist, so you save money there. So I think you can demonstrate how you grow your TAVI program, and you can say to your management, well, instead of appointing another interventional cardiologist, let's start by appointing a TAVI nurse coordinator. It's going to cost less, but it's going to help to grow the program.
So Dan, thanks very much. So we're just going to close now. It's been a fantastic discussion, a lively discussion at the beginning of the last day of PCR London Valve. I've enjoyed it immensely. We've learnt that digital age is here, and we need to embrace everything that it offers us for the benefit of our patients and our teams. We've learnt that TAVI nurses are absolutely fundamental to the success of our programs, and we could not do it without you. And finally, we've learnt that we need to engage with our managers in a constructive way to persuade them of the advantages of minimally invasive procedures and the cost effectiveness that they provide. So thanks very much for joining us this morning. I really hope that you enjoy the last day of the course. Thank you for coming to this session.